you wake to the smell of rosewater and the cloying sweetness of ambergris. Your skin, scrubbed raw and perfumed, feels alien to you. The silk of the divan is a cold caress against your back. In the flickering candlelight, you see the impassive faces of the women who have prepared you, their movements precise, their eyes empty. This is it. This is the night sex in the Sultan's harem becomes your reality, a terrifying ritual where your only role is submission. To understand how she arrived at this moment, a pawn in a game of absolute power and fragile ego, we must unravel the threads of her life. These are the quiet histories, the whispers from gilded rooms that we bring to light. If you believe these stories must be told, join our community by subscribing and share your reflections on this forgotten world in the comments below. Her journey, like that of countless others, began not with the splendor of a palace, but with the profound trauma of loss and the cold, unfeeling calculus of the slave trade. Her name was Elara, and before she was a body to be perfumed and presented, she was a child in a village nestled deep within the snow-capped peaks of the Caucasus. Her world was one of wind-worn stone, the scent of wood smoke, and the familiar rhythm of seasons. This idyllic existence was shattered not by a natural disaster, but by a man-made one, the slave raid. It was a swift, brutal, and terrifyingly efficient affair. The men who descended upon her village were not soldiers fighting for a cause. They were merchants of human flesh, their eyes scanning the gathered villagers with the cold calculation of a butcher inspecting livestock. There were no grand battles, only the guttural screams of mothers being torn from their children, the splintering of doors, and the metallic tang of blood in the air. Elara, barely a woman at 13, was prized for her pale skin and green eyes, features that made her an exotic and valuable commodity. She was bound, hooded, and thrown onto a cart with other girls, their collective sobs a wretched symphony that accompanied the jarring journey down the mountain. The life she knew was gone, erased in a single, violent afternoon. The journey to Constantinople was a lesson in systematic dehumanization. Chained in the suffocating, lightless hold of a ship, the girls were treated as cargo. They were fed just enough to keep them alive, their bodies inspected and assessed with a humiliating detachment. The very concept of privacy, of self-ownership, was methodically dismantled. By the time they reached the sprawling, chaotic slave market of the great city, Elara was no longer the girl from the mountains. She was a shell, her spirit hollowed out by fear and grief, her identity stripped away layer by layer until all that remained was a beautiful, terrified object. In the market, she was put on a block, forced to endure the probing eyes and hands of potential buyers. It was here that she was spotted by an agent of the palace, a eunuch whose gaze held not lust, but the discerning eye of a connoisseur selecting a piece of art for his master's collection. A price was named, a bag of gold exchanged, and Elara's fate was sealed. She had been purchased for the most exclusive and dangerous collection in the world, the Imperial Harem of the Ottoman Sultan. Her arrival at the Topkapi Palace was a disorienting assault on the senses. She was led through a series of imposing gates, each one more ornate and heavily guarded than the last, until she passed through the Gate of Felicity and into the cloistered, forbidden world of the harem. The sheer opulence was breathtaking. Courtyards of intricate tilework, fountains that sang with the music of falling water, and chambers adorned with gold leaf and mother of pearl. Yet, beneath this shimmering veneer of beauty, a palpable sense of dread and confinement permeated the air. This was not a home, it was a gilded cage, a fact made terrifyingly literal by the nearby cafes, the pavilion where the Sultan's brothers and nephews were held in luxurious imprisonment, a constant, silent reminder that even royal blood offered no escape from the cage. As a new arrival, a carrier, Elara was at the absolute bottom of a ferociously rigid and complex hierarchy. At its apex was the Valide Sultan, the Queen Mother, the true ruler of this female domain. Below her were the Khaden, the Sultan's 4 official wives who had borne him children, then the Iqbal, the favored concubines who had captured the Sultan's fancy, followed by the Guzde, the girls who had been noticed and had spent a single night with the sovereign, and finally the vast anonymous sea of carrier, the novices and servants who made up the bulk of the population. Elara was now one of them, her past life a forgotten dream. Her indoctrination began immediately. The world she knew was to be unlearned, her native tongue forbidden, her old name replaced. She was given a new Turkish name, Gulnar, meaning pomegranate flower, a pretty label for a pretty thing. She was plunged into a rigorous training regimen designed to transform her from a foreign slave girl into a perfect courtly ornament. She spent endless hours learning the fluid, intricate cadence of Ottoman Turkish, a language that felt thick and alien in her mouth. She was taught to play the oud, to sing haunting melodies, and to perform dances that were graceful and suggestive, all skills intended for the pleasure of one man. But the most crucial part of her education was learning the adab, the labyrinthine code of etiquette that governed every single interaction within the harem's walls. The way one walked, the way one bowed, the precise manner of serving coffee to a superior reverie gesture was codified, and a single misstep could result in a brutal punishment. This training was a form of psychological conditioning, designed to erase her individuality and remold her into a docile, obedient creature whose only purpose was to serve the system and its master. The girls who failed to adapt, who clung to their past or showed a rebellious spirit, simply disappeared, their fates a dark, unspoken warning to the others. Elara, intelligent and terrified, learned quickly. She learned to silence the screams in her own mind, to wear a mask of placid obedience, and to navigate the treacherous currents of the harem with the silent, watchful caution of a hunted animal. The architecture of power within the harem rested upon two great unassailable pillars that stood just beneath the Sultan himself, the Valide Sultan and the Kizlar Agha. To the outside world, the Sultan was an absolute monarch, his will divine and unquestionable. But within the cloistered confines of the harem, his own mother, the Valide Sultan, wielded a power that was arguably more direct and intimate. She was not merely a doting mother, she was a master political strategist, a ruthless executive whose corporation was the Imperial dynasty. Her entire existence, her security, and her immense wealth were contingent on her son's reign and, more importantly, on the successful continuation of his line through her chosen channels. She controlled the harem's vast budget, appointed its officials, and orchestrated the complex web of alliances and rivalries among the women. She was the one who selected the girls for her son's bed, viewing them not as individuals, but as broodmares in a high-stakes genetic lottery. Her affection was a political tool, her displeasure a death sentence. She moved through the harem's marbled halls like a living deity, her presence inspiring a mixture of awe and terror. She was the ultimate matriarch of this deeply dysfunctional family, a woman whose love for her son had curdled into an obsessive need to control every aspect of his life, especially his sexuality, which she understood was the wellspring of dynastic power. Her partner in this suffocating administration was the Kizlar Agha, the Chief Black Eunuch. He was a figure of profound and tragic contradiction. Stolen from his home in Africa as a boy and subjected to the horrific brutality of castration, he had survived a trauma that killed many, and had risen through the ranks on a tide of intelligence, ambition, and a cultivated cruelty born from his own deep-seated resentment. As the commander of the eunuch corps, he was the harem's chief jailer, the enforcer of its draconian rules. He was the only man, aside from the Sultan, who could move freely within its walls, and this access gave him unparalleled influence. He was the gatekeeper, the intermediary between the Sultan and his female court. It was the Kizlar Agha who procured new girls, who oversaw their training, and who physically escorted the chosen concubine down the golden road to the Sultan's bedchamber. He saw everything, heard every whisper, and his loyalty was primarily to the Valide Sultan, with whom he formed a formidable political alliance. He was the ultimate, complicit system enforcer, a man whose own profound suffering had not bred empathy, but had instead desensitized him, turning him into a perfect, unfeeling instrument of the very system that had destroyed his own life. His gaze was a void, reflecting the emptiness of his own fate, and in his quiet, authoritative presence, the women of the harem saw a chilling vision of absolute, institutionalized power. The center of this universe, the sun around which all these terrified planets orbited, was the Sultan. But this was no magnificent, radiant star. He was a collapsing one, a black hole of paranoia and dysfunction whose immense gravitational pull warped and destroyed everything that came too close. Sultan Ibrahim I, a man not born to rule but thrust into it by the cruel vagaries of dynastic survival, was the living embodiment of the dysfunctional tyrant archetype. He had spent his formative years locked away in the cafes, the gilded cage, listening for the footsteps of the executioners his older brother might send at any moment. This prolonged psychological torture had shattered his mind long before he ever ascended to the throne. When he was finally told he was sultan, he was so consumed by terror that he refused to believe it, barricading himself in his chambers until his mother had his predecessor's corpse brought to him as proof. This was the man who now held absolute power over an empire. His deep-seated psychological trauma manifested as a volatile and erratic reign. Publicly, this led to catastrophic misrule and whimsical cruelty. But privately, within the harem, his damage took on a far more personal and terrifying form. His years of isolation and fear had resulted in a profound sexual psychosis. He was a man plagued by impotence, by bizarre and humiliating perversions, and by an insatiable need for absolute control to compensate for his own feelings of powerlessness. His obsession with his harem was not about pleasure or even dynastic duty. It was about creating a fantasy world where he was the unquestionable god. He famously became obsessed with obese women, sending his agents across the empire to find the most corpulent women imaginable, culminating in his bestowing of a governorship upon one favorite he nicknamed Sugar Cube. He would force his concubines to perform strange, humiliating rituals, treating them less as human beings and more as props in his twisted psychodramas. The act of sex, for him, was rarely about consummation. It was an exercise in domination, a way to project his power onto the helpless bodies of the women he owned. This was the dark secret at the heart of the empire. The man who commanded its armies and held the power of life and death over millions was, in his most private moments, a broken, pathetic, and terrifyingly dangerous individual. His sexual dysfunction had metastasized into a political psychosis, and the harem was his laboratory, the place where his most depraved and desperate fantasies were made horrifyingly real. For the women like Elara, sex with the sultan was not an erotic fantasy, but a summons to a private audience with madness itself. For years, Elara, now known as Gulnar, remained in the background, one of hundreds of anonymous faces in the Carrier pool. She survived by being invisible, by mastering the art of silent obedience. She watched as other girls were chosen, some rising to become Gozde for a fleeting moment, others disappearing after incurring the displeasure of a powerful eunuch or the Valide Sultan. She saw the vicious, silent wars fought between the women, the whispered slander, the stolen trinkets, the subtle acts of sabotage. It was a world of constant, low-grade terror, where a single misstep could lead to ruin. She learned that to be noticed was to be endangered, yet to remain unnoticed was to be condemned to a life of perpetual servitude and obscurity. Her moment finally came not through any grand design, but by chance. The Sultan, in one of his erratic moods, was walking through a courtyard where the novices were taking their music lesson. He was foul-tempered, his mind clouded by whatever demons plagued him that day. As the girls bowed low, a collective wave of fear passing through them, Elara's oud slipped from her nervous grasp and clattered on the marble tiles. The sound was an explosion in the oppressive silence. Every girl froze, expecting a storm of royal rage. Elara kept her face to the floor, her heart hammering against her ribs, convinced her life was over. But instead of rage, there was a strange, thoughtful silence. The Sultan, his attention snagged by the sudden disruption, simply said, "The one who is clumsy. Bring her to me tonight." The words were spoken with a chilling indifference, as if he were ordering a specific dish for his supper. The legendary throwing of the handkerchief, a romantic myth for outsiders, was a fiction. The reality was this, a cold verbal command that sealed her fate. From that moment on, her world was thrown into turmoil. She was immediately separated from the other Carrier and taken over by the senior women of the harem. The news of her selection spread like wildfire, and with it came a tidal wave of envy and hostility. The other girls, who were her companions in misery just an hour before, now looked at her with a mixture of awe and venom. She was no longer one of them. She was a potential rival, a new player in the brutal game of favor. The preparation for the night was an elaborate, terrifying ritual of objectification. She was taken to the hammam, the bathhouse, where she was stripped and bathed by attendants who handled her limbs with an impersonal efficiency, scrubbing, oiling, and perfuming her body until she felt less like a person and more like a sacrificial animal being prepared for the altar. Her own will, her own feelings, were completely irrelevant. She was being transformed, polished, and packaged for the consumption of the Sultan. As they dressed her in layers of impossibly fine silk and adorned her with jewels that felt heavy and cold against her skin, she caught a glimpse of her reflection. The face that stared back was that of a beautiful stranger, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it seemed to suck all the light from the room. She was no longer Elara from the mountains, nor was she truly Gulnar. She was an offering. The journey to the Sultan's private chambers was a walk through a living nightmare. Guided by the silent, imposing figure of the Kizlar Agha, Elara was led down the famed Golden Road, a short corridor that connected the harem to the Sultan's quarters. Yet it felt like the longest path she had ever walked. The corridor was opulent, its walls lined with precious tiles, but the air was thick with the ghosts of all the women who had walked this path before her, their hopes and fears seeming to cling to the very air she breathed. The eunuch's slippers made no sound on the plush carpets, his silence more terrifying than any threat. He stopped before a pair of immense, ornately carved doors, and with a glance that was neither cruel nor kind but simply vacant, he opened them and gestured for her to enter. She stepped inside, and the doors closed behind her with a soft, final thud, sealing her in. The imperial bedchamber was a cavern of suffocating luxury. Heavy velvet curtains blocked out the world, and the only light came from dozens of candles that cast flickering, monstrous shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the scent of musk and incense, so heavy it was difficult to breathe. The Sultan was reclining on a vast, low divan, a mountain of silk pillows surrounding him. He did not look at her immediately, continuing to idly toy with a string of prayer beads. For an agonizingly long moment, she stood frozen, a statue of silk and terror, waiting for him to acknowledge her existence. When he finally looked up, his eyes were not filled with lust, but with a weary, clinical curiosity, like a scientist observing a new specimen. He gestured for her to approach. The protocol she had been drilled on was precise. She was to crawl on her knees from the door to the foot of the divan, to kiss the edge of the carpet, and to remain in a prostrate position until given leave to rise. It was an act of ultimate debasement, designed to strip her of the last vestiges of her dignity before the encounter even began. The sex itself, when it came, was a fulfillment of all her worst fears. It was not an act of passion or even desire. It was a mechanical, joyless, and brutal assertion of power. Sultan Ibrahim's psychological damage was on full display. He was rough, distracted, and seemed to derive his only satisfaction from her fear and humiliation. The encounter was a clinical, almost sterile procedure of dominance, devoid of any human connection. It was a violation not just of her body, but of her soul, a terrifying confirmation that in this world she was not a person with feelings or a history. She was a thing, a receptacle for the whims of a broken and powerful man. Lying there in the dark, feigning the pleasure she had been instructed to display, all she could think of was the cold stone of her childhood home and the feel of the mountain wind on her face, a world that now seemed more distant and impossible than the stars. The morning after was as ritualized and impersonal as the night had been. Before dawn, she was woken by attendants and quietly escorted from the Sultan's chambers, leaving him to his sleep. There was no conversation, no tender farewell. The transaction was complete. Back in the harem, she was led to the chambers of the Hazinadar, the chief treasurer, where, as per tradition, a purse of gold coins was placed in her hands. It was her payment, the price for her service, a gesture that starkly reinforced her status as property. The gold felt obscene in her palm, a cold, heavy symbol of her own degradation. But everything had changed. She had survived the ordeal, and in doing so, her status within the harem's rigid hierarchy had been irrevocably altered. She was no longer an anonymous carrier. She was now a guzde, one of the favored or noticed ones. This new title brought with it immediate and tangible benefits. She was moved from the crowded dormitory of the novices into a semi-private chamber, a small but significant luxury. She was given finer clothes, better food, and a small retinue of her own servants' girls who just yesterday had been her peers. The way people looked at her was different. The eunuchs, who had previously been dismissive, now offered a slight, almost imperceptible nod of respect. Senior women who had ignored her now acknowledged her presence. But with this elevation came a new and more insidious kind of danger. The fawning attention of some was matched by the venomous, silent hatred of others. The other Gozde, her direct competitors, saw her as a threat. The more established Iqbal and Kaidan viewed her with a contemptuous suspicion. She was now a player in the great game, whether she wanted to be or not. A hollow dread settled in her stomach like a stone. This success felt like a profound failure. She had gained a foothold in this treacherous world, but the cost was a piece of her soul. She realized with chilling clarity that her survival now depended not just on the Sultan's whim, but on her ability to navigate these new, dangerous currents. There was only one path to real, lasting security, one way to transcend the precarious status of a temporary favorite and achieve true power. She had to conceive. She had to bear the Sultan a son. The thought, which should have been a natural desire, became a cold, all-consuming obsession, born not of maternal instinct, but of the desperate clawing calculus of survival. Her body was no longer her own. It was now a political arena, and the battle for a child was a battle for her life. The desperate prayer born of terror was answered. Within a few months, the signs became undeniable, and the palace physicians, the solemn-faced, complicit system enforcers of the harem's biological machinery, confirmed it. Gulnar was pregnant. The news rippled through the harem with the force of a political earthquake. Suddenly, she was no longer just a Gozda, a fleeting fancy. She was the potential mother of a Shehzadi, a prince, a future heir to the throne of the Ottoman Empire. Her status exploded overnight. She was immediately moved to one of the most luxurious suites of apartments in the harem, her personal retinue of servants expanding dramatically. The Valide Sultan, the great matriarch who had until now been a distant, terrifying figure, summoned her for a private audience. The Queen Mother's eyes, ancient and sharp as obsidian chips, scrutinized her, assessing her not as a person but as a prized vessel, a crucial asset in the dynastic enterprise. Her health became a matter of state. A team of physicians was assigned to her, monitoring her every meal, her every movement, her every moment of rest. The food she ate was tasted for poison by a designated servant before it touched her lips. The air in her chambers was heavy with protective incense, and her rooms were guarded day and night by eunuchs loyal to the Valide Sultan. This cocoon of protection, however, felt more like a prison. Her isolation was now absolute. She was a state secret, a precious treasure locked away from the world. And with this elevation, the paranoia that permeated the harem reached a fever pitch. Every shadow in the corridor seemed to hold a threat. Every servant's smile seemed to hide a dagger. The other concubines, especially those who had also shared the Sultan's bed and failed to conceive, watched her with an envy so corrosive it was almost tangible. She became the focal point of 1,000 silent curses, the target of whispers and plots hatched in the dark corners of the bathhouses and sewing rooms. She lived in constant, gnawing fear of a miscarriage, a convenient accident, a cup of tainted sherbet, a deliberate fall on a slippery marble floor. The child growing inside her was her only hope for a future, yet its presence turned her into the most vulnerable and despised woman in the palace. She could trust no one. The Valide Sultan's care was not for her, but for the royal blood she carried. The physician's diligence was not for her well-being, but for the health of the dynastic product. In the eyes of the system, she, Gulnar, the person, had ceased to exist entirely. She was merely the incubator. The venomous atmosphere of the harem soon coalesced around a single, powerful rival, a Kaidan named Turhan, a woman who had already borne the Sultan a daughter and held the precarious position of his chief consort. Turhan was beautiful, cunning, and deeply insecure, knowing that her power rested entirely on her ability to produce a male heir and maintain the Sultan's favor. Elara's pregnancy with a potential son was a direct threat to her entire world. She saw in Elara not a fellow victim of the system, but an existential rival who could supplant her, who could steal her future and the future of her own child. And so began a silent, vicious war, a campaign fought not with swords, but with whispers, insinuation, and psychological torment. Turhan was a master of the harem's dark arts. She couldn't risk a direct assault, which would be too easily traced back to her by the ever-watchful Valide Sultan and the Kizlar Agha. Instead, she waged a war of attrition on Elara's sanity. She would use her network of loyal servants to start rumors that Elara was secretly practicing black magic to ensure the child was a boy, that she had been unfaithful and the child was not the Sultan's, a lie so dangerous it was akin to treason. These whispers, potent as poison, would slither through the corridors and eventually reach the ears of the Sultan. The dysfunctional tyrant, Sultan Ibrahim, was a fertile ground for such seeds of paranoia. His shattered mind was incapable of distinguishing reality from fantasy, and he was easily swayed by insinuation. He began to look upon Elara with suspicion. Turhan would arrange for small, unsettling things to happen. A cherished piece of jewelry would go missing from Elara's chambers. A dish she particularly liked would be accidentally spilled. These were tiny pinpricks of harassment, designed to keep her constantly on edge, to fray her nerves and make her appear unstable. The system itself, perversely, encouraged this conflict. It was a method of control, ensuring that the women were so consumed with their internecine struggles that they could never unite and pose a collective threat. The Sultan, in his more lucid moments of cruelty, even seemed to derive a dark amusement from pitting his favorites against each other, watching them vie for his attention like animals fighting over a scrap of meat. Elara found herself trapped in a psychological vice. She was isolated by her pregnancy, terrified of plots against her and her unborn child, and now tormented by a powerful, unseen enemy. The gilded walls of her luxurious apartment became a prison of fear, and the dream of security that a child was supposed to bring had transformed into a waking nightmare of relentless anxiety. She was fighting a war on two fronts, one for the survival of her child, and another for the preservation of her own mind. The day of the birth was an event of monumental importance, the entire harem holding its breath. The Valide Sultan, the Kizlar Agha, and a retinue of the palace's most senior physicians and midwives gathered outside Elara's chambers, their faces tense with anticipation. After a long and agonizing labor, a cry echoed through the apartment, and a moment later a midwife emerged, her face a mask of professional calm. "It is a Shahzad," she announced, "a son." For a fleeting instant, a wave of profound relief and triumph washed over Elara. She had done it. She had fulfilled her purpose, secured her position, won the brutal game. She would be elevated to the rank of Kaidan, her son, a prince of the empire. Her future and his seemed assured. But this flicker of hope was extinguished almost immediately. The tragic ethos of the harem, its capacity for turning triumph into ashes, was about to reveal itself in the cruelest way possible. When the child was cleaned and presented to the Sultan, a horrified silence fell over the room. The baby, her son, was born with a visible, though minor, physical deformity, a misshapen foot. In a dynasty obsessed with physical perfection as a sign of divine favor and robust lineage, this was a catastrophe. Sultan Ibrahim, the dysfunctional tyrant, stared at the infant with a look of pure revulsion. In his paranoid and fractured mind, the child's imperfection was not a simple accident of birth. It was a personal affront, a dark omen, a reflection of his own deep-seated feelings of inadequacy and brokenness. He saw the child not as his son, but as a monstrous symbol of his own failure. His reaction was swift and merciless. He refused to hold the child, turning away in disgust and storming from the room without a word. The pronouncement was not spoken, but it was understood by everyone. The child was an unacceptable flaw in the imperial line. Elara's triumph had curdled into the bitterest of tragedies. The son that was meant to be her salvation had become the instrument of her damnation. The system that demanded she produce an heir had now rejected that heir, and her along with him. In that moment, holding her tiny, imperfect son, Elara understood the true, unforgiving nature of the cage she was in. It was a machine that demanded perfection, and it had no tolerance for the flawed, fragile, and deeply human reality of life. The fall from grace was as swift and brutal as her ascent had been meteoric. The Sultan's revulsion was a silent decree that echoed through the entire palace. Overnight, Elara, her blameless infant son, became pariahs. The luxurious suite of apartments was taken from her. She was moved, unceremoniously, to a small, damp set of rooms in a remote and forgotten wing of the harem, a place reserved for disgraced or unimportant women. The army of servants, physicians, and guards vanished, replaced by a single elderly servant who treated her with a weary pity that was almost worse than contempt. The river of fine foods, luxurious silks, and precious gifts dried up completely. She was once again given the plain, coarse fare of the lowest-ranking carrier. The Valide Sultan, who had personally overseen her every moment of pregnancy, now acted as if she did not exist. The Queen Mother's interest had been in the potential for a perfect prince. A flawed product was a failed investment, to be written off and discarded. The psychological toll on Elara was devastating. The hope that had sustained her through months of fear and isolation was violently ripped away, leaving a gaping wound in its place. The other women in the harem, who had watched her with poisonous envy, now openly scorned her. Her rival, Turhan, was seen smiling for the first time in months, her position once again secure. Elara became a walking cautionary tale, a ghost haunting the corridors, a living symbol of catastrophic failure. Her days devolved into a monotonous cycle of despair. She spent all her time in her small, dark rooms, her only companion, the infant son whose existence had condemned them both. She loved him with a fierce, protective desperation, but every time she looked at his small, misshapen foot, she was reminded of her own ruin. The child was a constant, painful, living embodiment of her shattered dreams. The silence in her rooms was absolute, a stark contrast to the buzzing hive of activity that had once surrounded her. The world of power, of politics, of favor, moved on without her, as if she had never been a part of it. She was a ghost in the machine, a component that had malfunctioned and been cast aside. Her mind, already strained by the relentless pressure, began to fray. The vibrant, resilient girl from the mountains was gone, consumed by the hollowed-out woman known as Gulnar, who had herself been erased. All that was left was a mother trapped in a cage of despair, clinging to a child deemed worthless by the very system she was forced to serve. Years passed, a slow, grinding succession of identical days blurring into a meaningless whole. The Sultan, Ibrahim, his reign growing ever more erratic and tyrannical, was eventually deposed and, in the brutal tradition of Ottoman politics, strangled with a silken bowstring by his own janissaries. A new sultan ascended the throne, and with his reign came a house-cleaning. The harem of the old, dead sultan was now a political and financial liability. The women who had once been the center of the world were now just inconvenient relics of a bygone era. A summons came for Elara. She and her son, now a quiet, withdrawn boy, were to be moved. They were not to be freed, nor were they to be executed. Their fate was something in between, a living death. They were exiled to the Eski Sarai, the old palace. This sprawling, decaying complex in a different part of the city was the traditional retirement home for the harems of deceased or deposed sultans. It was not a place of peaceful rest. It was a human warehouse, a gilded boneyard where powerful women were sent to be forgotten. The old palace was a world of shadows and echoes. Its vast, dusty halls, once as grand as those of the Topkapi, were now crumbling, the gold leaf peeling and the intricate tiles cracked. It was populated by hundreds of women, a silent, melancholy sea of has-beens. There were former Kadin who had once commanded immense influence, Iqbal whose beauty had once captivated a monarch, and countless Guzda and Carrier, all stripped of their titles, their power, and their purpose. They were ghosts, drifting through their days in a haze of memory and regret. The atmosphere was thick with a bitter, suffocating nostalgia. The women spoke endlessly of the past, of the days when they were beautiful, favored, and important. They clung to the phantom hierarchies of a court that no longer existed, their petty squabbles and ancient rivalries the only things that gave their empty lives a semblance of meaning. For Elara, this was the final, crushing blow. In Topkapi, Even in her disgrace, there had been a sliver of the world, a sense of life moving around her. Here, there was only stagnation. Time itself seemed to have stopped. She watched her son grow up in this environment of profound despair, a boy with no future, his royal blood a curse that trapped him in this limbo. She was no longer a player in any game. She was simply a forgotten piece, left on the board after the match was long over. She would live out the rest of her days here, in this living tomb, her name, her story, and her suffering slowly erased by the dust of ages, a quiet historian with no one left to tell her tale. The relentless, self-devouring nature of the system did not spare its chief architects. The very enforcers who had managed Elara's life and torment were themselves just cogs in the great impersonal machine, their power as fleeting as a concubine's favor. The formidable Valide Sultan, who had ruled the harem with an iron will, saw her power evaporate the moment her son, Sultan Ibrahim, was deposed. The new sultan brought with him a new mother, who promptly assumed the title and authority of Valide Sultan, casting her predecessor into the shadows. She who had exiled so many to the old palace eventually found herself relegated to a life of quiet irrelevance, her influence gone, her intricate web of power dismantled overnight. She died not as a queen regent, but as a dowager, a footnote in the history of the dynasty she had fought so ruthlessly to control. The fate of the Kizlar Agha was often even more direct and brutal. His immense power was entirely dependent on his relationship with the ruling sultan and his Valide Sultan. When the regime changed, he was an immediate target. A new sultan meant a new Kizlar Agha, a man loyal to the new power. The old one, with his deep knowledge of the previous court's secrets and his entrenched network of influence, was a threat. Some were merely dismissed and exiled, sent to live out their days in Egypt, far from the center of power. Others were not so lucky. The same eunuch who had once held the power of life and death over hundreds of women, who had escorted Elara down the Golden Road, could find himself accused of treason or corruption on the flimsiest of pretexts. His wealth would be confiscated, and he would be quietly executed, his body disposed of with the same impersonal efficiency he had once overseen. And what of Turhan, Elara's bitter rival, the woman who had seemingly won the great prize? Her victory was temporary. She too was subject to the whims of the sultan, the shifting political tides, and the inevitable passage of time. She may have enjoyed years of influence, but eventually her beauty faded. The sultan's eye wandered to a younger face, and she too was supplanted. Or perhaps she found herself on the losing side of a political struggle, outmaneuvered by a new favorite or a rival prince's mother. Ultimately, she would face the same fate as all the others, a slow decline into irrelevance or a swift exile to the living tomb of the old palace. The system consumed everyone it touched. It created a world of absolute precarity, where power was a phantom, loyalty was a currency of convenience, and no one, from the lowest courier to the highest kadin, from the most powerful eunuch to the Valide Sultan herself, was ever truly safe. They were all prisoners of the cage, just in cells of different sizes. In the end, we must pull back from the tragic, intimate story of one woman and see the harem for what it truly was. It was not the lurid, romantic fantasy so often depicted in Western art, a pleasure garden filled with languid, available beauties. That is a dangerous fiction. The reality was far darker, far more complex, and infinitely more tragic. The Imperial Harem was a sophisticated and brutal institution of statecraft, a crucible where dynastic succession was forged through the systematic control and exploitation of female bodies. It was a political organ as vital to the empire as its army or its bureaucracy. The sex that occurred within its walls was rarely about love or even about lust. It was a political act, a biological imperative, and a tool of absolute power. It was a transaction that could elevate a woman to unimaginable heights or condemn her to a lifetime of obscurity. For every Roxolana or Kusum Sultan who managed to climb the ladder of corpses to achieve real political power, there were thousands of forgotten women like Elara, renamed, used, and discarded. They were the human fuel that powered the dynastic machine. Their individual lives, their dreams, their trauma, and their profound suffering were deemed irrelevant, mere collateral damage in the grand project of imperial continuity. This was the ultimate horror of the gilded cage, its ability to completely erase the humanity of its inhabitants, reducing them to their biological function. Can you imagine the psychological torture of a life where your entire worth, your very survival, is tied to the whim of a single, often unstable man and your ability to produce a male child? This system did not just imprison women, it warped them, pitting them against each other in a desperate Darwinian struggle for survival. The harem was a monument to the human cost of absolute power, a place where the stones themselves seemed saturated with silent screams and unshed tears. The stories of these women have been largely lost to history, buried beneath layers of political chronicles and patriarchal narratives, but they are there, in the quiet spaces, in the whispers from the old palace. To remember them is to acknowledge a profound and unsettling truth, that the great, glittering edifice of empire was built upon a foundation of countless broken lives.